on. Make sure you test it. If you're reading off a script, you should put it in here. Are you going to read off a script?
Yeah, my
Okay.
phone. Okay, we good? Okay, thank you. Okay.
Make sure you get your. Whoops. If you get
Okay.
too close to this, it won't work.
All right. I want to thank everyone for coming this evening. I'm Donna Pilkington. I'm the program chair of Seconic Garden Club. I want to welcome everyone here. This is the last of the 3 historic Seconic Garden Club programs that we had in honor of our club's 50th anniversary and the town's 350th anniversary. So before we start, just a few housekeeping details. There's a sign-up sheet at both entrances, upstairs and downstairs, and that's if you want to receive notification of our public programs like this. We have some very good public programs, and people have missed some of them because they didn't know about them, so that's a way that you will stay informed. The other thing is we have Thor going to be speaking tonight, and he wrote a book called Stone by Stone, and that book is on sale downstairs, and after this program, Thor will be available to sign copies if you want that. The next thing is, do you want to join a fun group in town that is always up to something? If you do, there are membership applications for Seconic Garden Club. I think they're at the back and probably downstairs also. So the other thing is we also put donation vases out. I don't know if you noticed them. We had some unexpected expenses to we're taping this program. It will be available now live on YouTube, and it will be available on our website. And we wanted to do that because of consideration for the amount of people here, and we want to be mindful of fire code regulations. So please consider the donation vases. All right. Some of you may be here because of this article in the Providence Journal. Jack Perry is a reporter there, and he was interviewed Carolyn Montgomery, that I'm going to talk a little bit about, and Thor and myself. And the Providence Journal and the Seconic Times will be having an article on this also. It's kind of a hot topic, we're thinking. And this is actually the 3rd program today. This is a 3-part thing that Thor called me a couple of months ago and said, you know, instead of just doing this one thing, I'm doing 3. And it was like, okay, we're in for it. So the group that met this afternoon, there were about 20 of us. We took a walk of a wall in town, and then we had a round table talk. And the conclusion at that round table was there is enough interest in our town to think about conserving and inventorying the stone walls. Our walls are unique, and Thor will explain that when he speaks. But this is a sign-up sheet that when did we put this together? Like 4 o'clock this afternoon. So if you are interested in helping out to figure out how to go about inventorying and preserving our walls, please consider signing up here with your name, address, phone number, and all of that information. Okay, that's all my housekeeping. Right now, I want to call up Carolyn Montgomery, who's a founding member of our club, and really the person responsible for this, because when our club was looking for a project, she talked about her history with walls and her love of them in her 95 years living in this town. She's an institution, and so she's going to introduce our speaker. Carolyn?
Do I have to use this? I really have to use this? Yes, stone walls have been a part of our life. I grew up on Red Top Farm, which is on West Main Road, and as a child, we played on the walls. We sat on the walls, watched them bring in the hay from the field, watched them cultivate the vegetables that they grew. We had a dairy farm. So everything we would sit on the wall to watch all of this. And of course, the one thing my father didn't want us to do, he ran the farm for the sheriffs. He didn't want us running on the walls. He was afraid either we'd fall and hurt ourselves or some would be tumbling off. But of course, you know, as a child, we still ran on the walls. And it's been a part of my life. When I bought my property and built my house on West Main Road, there was a wall there, but it needed to be redone. And you know, there was a young man, Dennis Warren, and he was such a wall builder. He built the wall in the memorial wall around Veterans Field and used the stones were there, and there was enough to go start down the Meeting House Lane. But that's getting away from the project. I have never met this author. I have read his book, and I'm sure you're going to be interested in all the things. Every stone wall is different because of the stone that is available. If you go to Westport, they're granite. If you go here, they're that black slate, wherever, what you call it. But it's my pleasure to introduce him to the program. I think you'll be fascinated at what a wall really means to anyone living in Little Compton or this area. Thank you for coming.
They can sit still. Can you hear me? I'm going to have to walk around. I want to start with a story. I came early. I was photographing some of the stone walls in Little Compton. I remembered how nice they were. And two of your lovely citizens stopped and said, "Are you okay?" You know? Not that I go nuts over walls or anything, but they were actually concerned about my well-being. I don't think they were thinking I was an imposter or something like that, or worse, an inspector, you know? No, I was just taking pictures of your lovely walls so I could include them in tonight's talk. And maybe you're in the audience. Is anybody in here that asked me if I was okay? Or you're too sheepish to admit it? Okay, the second thing is I write a lot, okay? And so I have a bunch of books up here. There's like 8 of them. And it's not just about walls, and I'm not selling any books, but they're between 2 of my favorite stones, okay? And I just thought if you're curious about just writing it in general, New England environmental history and Little Compton and stone walls and stuff like that, have a look, okay? Just don't walk off with them, all right? Now, can I get the volume up just slightly? Are you okay on the volume? All right, let's get the lights, because I need to know that this is going to work. Oh, it works. That is a beautiful yellow lichen, right? Sitting on a stone. I'm sure you're familiar with all of that. And then, of course, there's this stuff that you're not sure what it is. The Narragansett group is what it's called. What that means is it's what some people call slate, and what looks like a fairly slabby gray rock that's all over the place around here. That is a very, very well compacted and heated up and slightly metamorphosed group of sediments that are muds and sands and gravels, okay? So just imagine a terrestrial basin filling, you know, with all kinds of fine-grained materials, and then having that basin descend into the Earth's crust 4 or 5 kilometers, straight down, okay? And then it comes back up to the surface, the glacier tears it apart, scatters that stone everywhere, and says, hey, if you want to farm, you have to move the stone aside, all right? And that's basically where that rock comes from. And in the middle one here is an exotic stone. I don't know what it is. It's something like a black marble or a basalt, okay? And it came from far away, and it's got glacier scratches and nick marks on it, so I can prove that, all right? And I didn't sample it because that would be a tragedy, okay? It's your wall, not mine, all right? It's just a far-traveled stone. So you have strangers in your midst also have the two basic kinds of rock that our introducer mentioned, all right? You've got this Narragansett gray, slabby stuff, and then you've got the granite, which dominates over by Westport. Okay, so those are the dominant themes. Does anybody have a question yet? There's one.
How did the foreign stones get here?
How did the stone get here?
No, the one that isn't.
Oh, it's carried in the shear zone of a glacier, but it's so strong that it won't be broken apart. It won't be pulverized into your sand. The farms that have the soil, that sand and silt probably comes from 1,000 kilometers away. You know, it's from Canada to New England. Once you get down to the sand stage, it goes a long ways. But the bigger you are as a chunk in that subglacial zone, the more likely you are to be broken up into a smaller chunk. So the bigger stuff is coming from a few kilometers away, all right, and the smaller stuff is coming from a long ways away. And every once in a while, a great big rounded granite erratic, all right, that shows up in your field somewhere. And those are usually far traveled. But I'm off the subject already. Let's click this forward. You gonna help? I got a volunteer. Okay, thanks. I forgot about the introduction, but at least I remember Donna, and Luke Driver's in the back of the table. He drove what I drove 2 years ago when we met in my neighborhood to film a documentary on Stonewall walling and whatever. Nothing ever came of it so far, you know, but we're still working on it. And we had a roundtable audience. Thank you all for your contributions, and I want to thank all of you for coming. Like I said, it's a nice town, and I had 2 people trying to help me even before I got in here. And that's just a lovely, lovely, lovely stone wall, double wall, you know, with 2 sides. It's a freestanding wall, you know, because it has 2 sides, you see? So we can start talking about the terminology of walls. And it's a built end rather than a dumped end, you know, so somebody actually thought about that. And it's really wide and really big, and that's not from here. That's from Glastonbury, Connecticut. Next slide. So walls look different everywhere you go. Next slide. Okay, once upon a time, I gave a talk to a group like this. It was the wrong talk, okay? I talked about Henry Thoreau and environmental history, and I was supposed to talk about stone walls, all right? Totally different stuff. And people were so polite, they didn't correct me until the end, saying, I have a question about stone walls. You spent like an hour talking about something else. So ever since that happened, doing the truth in advertising thing, I go and make sure to go to the website of the organization that wants me to talk, and I look at it, and I said, what did I tell them I would do a year ago? Because I've already forgotten. And then I read it, and I build my talk around doing that. Okay. And so this is the advertisement on the website, and so I am doing truth in advertising. And I want to say something. Donna didn't say it, but when she invited me a year and a half ago, I think, to come to this event, I said, are you here? Do you remember what I said?
You said, I don't talk anymore.
And she worked and worked and worked at me, and then the compromise was that if I'm going to come, I'm going to try and incentivize you guys, you know, to take a community interest in inventorying and mapping your stone walls. And if I can have access to the stakeholders, you know, then I'll come and give a free talk, all right? And of course, the walk is just thrown in like a training exercise. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, this was the wall on the right that was on the advertising. You know, it's just completely like and pasted wall with mostly rounded and pillow-shaped stones. I saw none of those today. Okay, so that must be over on the western part of town where the rounder, more granitic stones are. But it's still a lovely wall, and look at the walls in blue on the left. Little Compton is the yellow bullseye there. And I think you can get a sense of the scale and where the road turns, right? So you know where you are. And that's a clip from the University of Rhode Island's new mapping effort. These are not walls, they are alleged walls. In other words, these are lines drawn on this magnificent new tool called LiDAR, which is light ranging and imaging that allows you to look through the forest and through the scruff and see the walls. And what they did was they just drew straight lines where they think there are walls. Now, some of these are not walls, but most of them are, okay? And some of the walls they missed. okay? Because we need to ground truth these things. But this can be the beginning of the layer for Little Compton. Like you have a layer for assessment of properties, right? You all got your taxes. There's a layer for emergency services, isn't there, in your GIS system? All right, there's a layer for, what, parks? There's a layer for wetlands. Isn't there a layer in your town? Somebody in your town knows how to build a layer for the stone domain, which is basically historic material culture made of stone. Your forts, your walls, your piles, your cellar holes, you know, your notable stones like Treaty Rock, okay? In other words, you build a layer and then you can begin the process of filling that out and nuancing it, and then a generation from now, you're going to have so much to tell, you know, your grandchildren or great-great-great-grandchildren, all right, when they're kicking around and the walls are mostly there. We will know more about them. So doing an inventory of walls is like doing a census. If all you get is person, right, you know where people are and nothing else. You don't know whether they're male or female or young or old, right, or living together or living apart. You don't know much of that. All you have is you know there's a person there, and that's where we are right now with walls. We know think we have a wall there. So what I'm asking communities to do is to begin the process at whatever level you can, you know, whatever interest you have, you know, to start having more than just we think there's a wall there. You know, get a map. Where are the fat ones? Where are the double walls? Where are the skinny ones? Where are the teetering ones? Where are the whatever? Where are the suspected ceremonial stone landscapes? You know, let's get them in there in that thing and we can start talking about it and getting information. So, there you go. Next slide. So what is this? All my title slides are going to be blanked out by that top lamp housing. That says a closer look. Okay, so what is that? Well, it's simple. If I were to walk by it and I had a lot of time to think about it, I'd say, no problem, it's a wall. And you'd say, yeah, I agree. And then my next thing was, oh, it's a one-tiered, weakly coursed, uncapped, stacked, waist-high, lichen-crusted wall made of ball-shaped, hefted, laid fieldstone granitic stones. You see? Those are the kinds of things that you could look at, and it's the variation in those properties that will allow you, you know, to really draw meaningful information that no history book holds. It's basically archaeology, is really what we're talking. It's above ground archaeology. It's not James Dietz's Small Things Forgotten, you know, like belt buckles and coins and clay pipes and, you know, that kind of archaeology. It's not about excavation. Thomas Jefferson started American archaeology with the burial mounds in Virginia, right? And it's been associated with excavation forever. This is above ground archaeology in the same way that the Sphinx is above ground archaeology or the pyramids, you see? You don't have to be excavated to be archaeology. Next slide. Okay, this is my commercial break slide, all right? It's just a pretty, beautiful quartz boulder with some lovely hues, and of course this is a washed out color. You never know what color you're going to get when you run it through, you know, a Mac and the projector. You never know. So believe me, it's a beautiful quartz boulder, but when you see it, it means I'm done with that section, commercial break, we move on to the next one. You got it? Okay, and this is what I want to do. Takeaway. Some of you are going to have to leave. I want to make sure you get it at the beginning of the talk. Then the phenomenon. What is this phenomenon of stone walls beyond Little Compton? Little Compton. I got some slides to show you, and I'll make some commentary about them. I took them this morning. Then I want to digress a little bit and talk about what stone walls mean to me as a non-native. I moved here from Alaska, and when I say here, I mean New England, right? Because I moved from a state that was 2 orders of magnitude larger than all of New England. And I grew up in Minnesota, which is larger than all of New England, including the Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire that nobody's ever seen, way up there, all right? So when you move from Alaska to here and you're a geologist, New England is one place, all right? It's one place, bounded by the Hudson River on the west. You know, if Martha's Vineyard, right, is New England, if Nantucket is New England, well, then so is Long Island. So is Block Island. It's the same thing made of the same stuff by the same agency in the same physiographic region. All right? So that's what I think. If we get through that, I'm going to just show a few slides about threats to walls. I don't think you have as much concern as most places because you already think your walls are pretty cool. But on the way here, I drove by a sign that said, "We buy stone walls." Okay? And I'll show you a picture of that later. And what this happens is you go in there and you strip mine those walls. Yes, you can do that if you're a private landowner. But they will load them in pallets, put them on a semi, and ship them out west somewhere where they can get a lot more money for them. Meanwhile, you have strip mined your history. And I don't like that. I'm not a native New Englander. I ended up here, and boy, what a great place. History and origin, this is a longer section of the talk, but it's basically why do we have walls? People are interested in that. Where did they come from? Why are they here? Why do we have so many in New England and not west of the Hudson River? And not south of New York City? And not north of southern Maine? Why? Why in that 50,000 square mile region do we have so many walls that they're the defining landform of the interior rural country? More volume probably than our beaches. More mass than our wetlands, I'm guessing. Our wetland soils. They're a colossal phenomenon, but they have slipped through the cracks of history, archaeology, geology, and archaeology. They've slipped through the cracks and they are coming into their own. I think they're the signature landform, and I think Little Compton tentatively has more walls concentrated than any other town. Certainly Rhode Island does. In 1871, there was a federal census of fencing done. And that census showed that Rhode Island had way more stone walls than any other state in New England. Way more. That's data based on statistics, federal statistics like a census. It was a census, but it wasn't of people, it was of fences. Remember the range wars out west? There's a classic idea. They're going to get Congress is going to appropriate money to just work on the cattlemen versus the farmers and the ranchers out west. Who has to fence and who doesn't? So they did a census, and all the New Englanders said, "Well, you can census our fences too." And it was an extraordinary database that Rhode Island wins the lottery on. We get done with that. A few recommendations, and I'll be done. And then lots of Q&A. And the book she's talking about was published so long ago that it became a classic 3 years ago. And so somebody brought it out in Audible, audiobook, saying, "Oh, wait a minute, if it's still selling after 20 years, we should probably make money by bringing out an audiobook." And they did. Whoops. Yeah, there you go. And then it just last month, I'm delighted. The publisher nominated it for the National Outdoor Book Award. It won't win because it's too unorthodox, right? It won't win, but it's not exactly an outdoor book, is it? Yes, it is. It is an outdoor book. It's just so weird they won't pick it, but I think that's pretty cool. Okay, so now you know where you're going, right? Take the next slide. See? This is going to announce what we're doing next. Next. Okay. On the left is something that I put together after about 5 of these 3-event days. And it's called the Manual for Inventory and Description. It's way too big and it's all publicly available on the web, okay? So you can get it easily. All right, Donna can find it for you. All right. And basically it's a way to help communities go out and collect the information and do a census of their walls and an inventory. And these are new possibilities for young and old. Mainly the retired people who are still healthy that want a good reason to be outdoors, all right? And then the young people who we really need to draw. We really need to draw them in here if we don't. So these are like minimum wage jobs to go out and inventory stone walls. It wouldn't cost that much, or maybe they would do it as a volunteer or trade for something else. But I want to get some young people involved in the labor or the happy labor. It's like knitting, that's like happy labor. It takes time, and it takes a little bit of effort and a little bit of focus, but, you keep doing it anyway. It's a bit like that to inventory your walls. And then the plan is To get the players together, we've already done that. To get a GPS layer, I want one in town, and I think that it doesn't matter what I want, it's what you guys want. And I heard several people at the round table say, yep, let's get a layer in town for the stone domain. And then get the youth involved, and finally, it's a new source. You can tell history that you don't know already, you know, if you had a decent data. I mean, history is mainly about census data anyway, isn't it? So let's take a census of your walls. Next slide. That was quick, one slide. The phenomenon. Next. Wow. This is a uncopyrighted image that I found on one of my Block Island trips, taken from Beacon Hill in the 1880s, I forget one. And it was being sold by the Historical Society. And I said, who has copyright? Robert Downey was selling it, but a guy named Robert Downey, but I found out he didn't have copyright. So it's just in the public domain. And it is the best picture that I've seen of showing the phenomenon of walls when everything is cleared. Now, Block Island is settled, you know, in the late 17th century with 10 or 11 families, and within a century, they were burning peat, all right, because all the trees had been burned. All right, because it's an island, you know, and it's restricted, and so you can't go west or north or whatever. You stay where you are, like Ireland, right? You stay where you are, and you intensify your work. And so there's a lot of walls there. That's my point. Tiverton looks like this, except it's not hexagons. They're mostly squares. You saw that? I'll show you that map. They're mostly rectangles. Next slide. And this is the same place on the right. And the same thing happened here. You just can't see it, and LiDAR is helping us see through that. So on the left, where the red line is, that's the end of the pier. Notice there's an end of the pier on the one on the right. And then there's the tallest hotel. That's also there. So those two red lines, you know, different focal length in the cameras, you know, so I can't make them identical. But those are the same places. And so what happened is people had farms, they had walls, they walked away from the farming way of life, and guess what? The trees grew back like weeds. Next thing you know, we have a forested landscape with walls in the canopy, below the canopy. Really a cool story. Next slide. This I found just a few weeks ago, 1836. This could be Little Compton. There's a guy named John Warner Barber that just toured the whole state, and he wrote this beautiful book and sketched 150 lithographs or something. He was just trying to show what towns were like before photography. And he wasn't an artist, he just wanted to capture what was there. So this is Groton, but it's a point sticking into a bay, you know, in the South Atlantic, right? So you got the same thing here, you know? It's basically a point of land, and look at the coastal bluffs above the sailboats. You got that here, you see? And then you've got these rolling, rounded hillsides, and then you've got that crisscross pattern of stone walls, in this case, without a tree in sight, except one clump in the middle above the ship. Do you see that? That's a lithograph to capture what was there in 1835. A monument? Yeah, forget about that. You don't have that. You don't want that. Next slide. And now a tour, the phenomenon, right? A picture is worth 1,000 words. How trite is that? We've heard it too many times, but it works. So this is the phenomenon. That is mostly marble. Out in Sherman, Connecticut, in the Valley of Vermont, you know, that limestone belt that runs all the way up to Canada? And that's what a wall looks like when it's made mostly of marble, especially on the top. Next slide. That's Montauk Point. And those are hard stones. Those are the quartzites. They're the rounded ones. You can hardly break them up. And so they end up, and when you build a wall out of that, it's a lace wall. You can see through it like lace because of the 26% volume porosity for spheres. I mean, you can't pack spheres without lace. And if you only have a single panel of a wall, you're going to see through it. You're not trying to make it look like a thing. You just can't make a non-lace wall with rounded boulders. So there's an interest in the aesthetic and the mechanics and the geology, you see? It all comes from the geology anyway. Next slide. And I really like this one. In eastern Connecticut, there's the collapsing basement problem. I don't know if you've heard about it here. But there's one mineral responsible for more than $1 billion worth of collapsing basements because the mineral doesn't, it's an iron sulfide called pyrrhotite that doesn't work, all right, with lime mortar, but it was hidden in the mortar mix, and so you pour the foundation and the basement crumbles apart, all right? It turns to sulfuric acid and wallboard, soft gypsum wallboard, right, and iron stain, and we're looking at the iron stain. So we got a beautiful wall of cut granite, and there's one slab on the horizontal there that has that mineral in it, and it's painting the stone below it with that leachate as it falls apart. It's like a chemical reaction taking place inside the stone. You're lucky you don't have pyrrhotite walls. Next slide. A generic wall on the way here from Storrs, Connecticut to Little Compton, 2 hours and 8 minutes by my travel coming through Newport, okay? And I pass right by this wall every time. It's just your basic farmstead wall, you know, that's nothing fancy, and of course it has barbed wire, because walls never made good fences anyway, except in southern Rhode Island, when they're strong enough and tall enough to do the job. But over most of New England, most walls are thigh-high, and a lot of your walls are thigh-high too. Next slide. This is a weird one. There could be a dinosaur footprint in this stone wall. You hardly ever get stone walls out of soft sedimentary rocks. They're just, the glacier picks them up and crushes the stones. They instantly go to sand, okay? But in this case, we're only like 100 meters from the source outcrop, and there was a litter of boulders turned into a wall, and it's that red bed, Jurassic sandstone, in the Central Valley that goes from Brattleboro, Vermont, all the way to New Haven on the western New England. And it's the same rock. It's really cool. It's got fossils in it and everything. I've seen hardly any of these. They're so rare. So the idea is that some walls are rare. Walls have a look for a reason, and that's the triad. The triad of what is the rock, what did the glacier do with it, and what did the humans do with what the glacier did with what the rock is. Okay, so those are the three basic factors. And you can explain a wall with those three factors. And I had fun doing it with Little Compton today. Next slide. What a cool slide. That's just a jagged, big old nothing. That's from, I think, Lyme, Connecticut, I think it is. That's just rock that is hardly rounded, but it's not slabby like your rock is either. It's not a layered sedimentary rock, It's a hard, crystalline rock that was pressurized tectonically to give you those jagged slabs. Next slide. Here's a pattern for upper eastern Connecticut. This is not your pattern. These are isolated farms on highlands just doing their own thing, right? And in Little Compton, it was surveyed and laid out, on that basic grid from north-northwest to south-southeast. There were plots and lands laid out, and those boundaries are still being honored. Here, it's just like you go up in there and carve out some land and make a farm, and you end up with the pattern. So the patterns matter. They're related to all kinds of things. Next slide. That's southern New Hampshire, Salisbury. That's the rectilinear pattern that is similar to what you have, but theirs is more square. Yours is more elongated. So every place is different, even though they're the binding threads that unify the regional culture of all of New England. Next slide. Okay, we did that. That was the phenomenon. So we now know what the phenomenon looks like and is. Next slide. There's your picture of Little Compton on the left. Did I show that earlier? I think I did. And on the right, that's just the Google Earth satellite image. And I think you can see that there is a relationship between where walls are most concentrated and where they're not. That big patch of forest on the right, probably a wetland as well, a moist lowland forest, got fewer walls in it. That tells you something already. It tells you that the settlers preferred the upland rounded hilltops where the roads now are. They didn't prefer the lowlands where the soils were richer and more organic. And that's because the upland rounded hills are actually better for grazing, and that was their main gig. Grazing, not tillage. In most of New England, the average amount of tillage on a 100-acre farm is no more than 20 acres. In other words, 1/5 or less. And on some farms, it's only like 5 acres. It's mostly about silage and hay and, and not grain crops with a plow. Next slide. I had trouble getting a good map of Rhode Island, and that made this projector makes it even worse, okay? But if you can recognize western Rhode Island and recognize Saconet Point down there on the right, okay, that reddish and purplish stuff, that is hard crystalline bedrock, probably, 800 million years old, probably. It's like granite. Think of it as granite, okay? And the stuff that you can't really, and look at Newport. See, you've got pieces of that along the south shore of Rhode Island. That's also hard, old, ancient rock. And what's north of Newport is a basin. And what's in that basin? A great, big, thick pile of muddy sandstones and shales and slates that became pressed into pudding stones and sandstones and shales. And when deeply pressed, it becomes slate and metaconglomerates and quartzites. All right, so the geology is straightforward, but the idea is that Little Compton is on that purple zone, but almost all of your walls are made from Narragansett Basin stuff. Now, maybe that's something you didn't know. The further east I got in this town, the more granite I saw. That's because we're seeing less of the Narragansett group because the glacier is just not able, it's already crushed it up by then, you see? Now, I can't go the details here, but the geology can explain the pattern of walls and tells you why your walls look the way you do. Next slide. Oh, there's the real geologic map. This is unmapped because it's Massachusetts, okay? But over here, this is called a porphyritic granite. That's what the State Geological Survey says is underneath of us. Now, I didn't see a wink of it. Not a wink of it. I saw some that in the walls that looked like they were probably from that material, but most of it was dominated by the basin to the west. Next slide. I went to Treaty Rock. It was a lot of fun. Treaty Rock is the place where a treaty was not signed, but discussed, okay? And that's about the only thing, and that it could be seen on the horizon from Middletown. I learned that. Everything else is suspect. So I went to see if it's an erratic or not. I couldn't find any drill markings. They said it was blown up. They said it was blown up with gunpowder. I couldn't see any evidence of that. And I said, what's the story here? It's made of Narragansett group stuff, but it's sitting on granite, so why? And I never solved the problem, but it doesn't look like that anymore. But it's an interesting place anyway, and thank you for sending me this picture. Next slide. I showed you this already. I just wanted to enlarge it, to talk about the mysteries hiding in your walls. Next slide. Oh, look at that silo. It's just taken out by the light. Can we lower the projector at all? Anybody know? Oh, forget it. It's over there. You need a 20-foot ladder to do that. You're just going to have to remember that there's the top of a silo in that picture. All right, I took these pictures today, and I want to remind you that, that this was farming country. And the silos, I saw a couple, they're caved in and falling apart. The farms are needing to be rebuilt and all of that. But this was a tremendous dairy, thank you, tremendous dairy country, early on, like a century ago. And a lot of that farming way, and now it's largely a residential place with some farming and good things happening. But that's basically, it has changed. But it was, and that of course, that's, I think, knotweed. That's your worst invasive. And so that also tells you something about changes in the land. Next slide. Just some pictures. On the left, just a beautiful double wall. I saw more of those than just about any others. And by double, what I mean is it's got two faces. You build one side looking nice and you build the other side looking nice. They slant in towards each other and support each other. And whether or not it's capped by a single layer of tabular stones or not, I don't know. It doesn't matter. The classification, because this is a capped double wall. And on the right, that's what it looks like when wall is dumped rather than laid. That is stone that comes out of a field and it's just pitched to the edge, and that's the way most of the fields would have looked before people went to the trouble of building the walls. It's not like somebody cuts down the forest and says, I can't wait to build a wall. That's not the way it happened. What happened is they cut down the forest and they ignite a series of physical reactions in the soil and the micrometeorology that cause frost heaving and cause surface erosion and cause animal compaction and cause loss of organic matter and cause an increase in the thermal conductivity of the soil. And all of these things sum up to taking the rock at depth and bringing it up to the surface. And then, of course, you've already got the trees. You got your kids hungry. You're running out of time. You got to do something. What do? You scuttle the stone aside, because everybody's got their share. Okay, so you can't sell it, right? So, and you don't even want to sell it. You want to get rid of it. So most of the stone initiates as refuse, scuttled aside, to fence lines with not much thought of walls. Walls came later. Walls came a generation later, or maybe a decade later, or whenever you got the act together to do something with a stone that's cluttering your fence lines. That's just a general rule of thumb. Next slide. On the left, that's just a mishmash, of different stone shapes and sizes and compositions. Now, we spent a lot of time outdoors talking about the difference between a shale and a slate, and a phyllite, and a schist, and a gneiss, okay, and a migmatite, and a granite, okay? That's a continuum. If you take mud, you just push it downward, you go through all of those phases. And so we spent some time looking at those and what it means, but there's also different shapes. There are blocks, there are tablets, there are balls, there are pillows, there are prisms, and there are columns. So you can learn what a shape is. Just use a word to tell you. You don't have to measure all day long. And look at these beautiful stones on the right, these capstones. Nature doesn't do that, okay? These have to be shaped into squares. The thickness of it is often natural. Sometimes they're split, but the square shape, that's usually you get rhomboids. Nature usually gives you rhomboid when it breaks up material like this in the crust. So you got to knock the corners off and cut it your own way. Okay, next slide. These are little Compton. These are so cool. And I hope I'm telling you something about your walls that I didn't take pictures of until this morning. And I like this one. This is just a view with a nice looking, beautiful green field behind it, washed out. But it's one face of a wall, and it's definitely laid. And if you'll notice, the coursing and the laying gets better as you go up. You see that? So the bottom is not quite as nice as the top in terms of the degree of order, and that's some history that's hiding. You can learn something about that and learn that this is an architectural wall, because a farmer is not going to square off those capstones. They're not going to do that. They're still in their first generation. Maybe by the third or fourth generation, they've got the wherewithal and the time and the children and the grandchildren to do that, but not right away. This is not pioneering. Next slide. And then there's the indigenous stonework around here somewhere. Way back to Stonewall John, like King Philip's War, that early. That early, the Narragansetts began to specialize in hiring themselves out for stonework. And this does not mean that there aren't earlier things, on the landscape that are like needles hiding in the landscape. They're there, we just have to, if you can't find them without an inventory. You need to see the anomaly sticking out in order to properly identify them. Okay, and this I just saw, somebody sent me this picture, and Jay Dolan, who I have no idea who it is, put it on Facebook, and I don't do Facebook, so I'm not trying to claim credit for this, but he just shared with a friend of mine who remains anonymous, this nice picture. Next slide. With that, we did little Compton walls. Next. Why do they matter? Why does stone matter? We have a reverence for stone. It's biblical, okay? The cemetery I drove by is all about stone. The headstones and the posts around it. Those are All stone. Why stone? Why not plastic? It lasts longer. It works. Why just wood? Why stone? We have a reverence for it. I don't need to explain it. I've been reading a book by Michael Morris. He's an evolutionary psychologist, and he claims there are 3 fundamental tribal instincts that launched humanity to be so successful. One of them is the ancestor instinct. You know, revering the past, it's just in us. It's what drives historical societies. It's what drives reverence of elderly people, okay? It's what makes us appreciate old graveyards. It's why you want to have your landscape not look like West Middletown. You know what I mean? You know, I drove that strip today. You know, from the Navy base up to Portsmouth. You know, that's just like a strip could be anywhere in America. That's not what you want your town to look like. You know that. You know, so it matters what we choose for our material culture. And plastic has lots of advantages, all right? Tremendous advantages. But stone is something we revere. And one of the reasons we revere it is it captures, this picture captures the entire history of the earth. Earth is born of dust that becomes rock, the planet rock, and then it cools into a crust, it melts, and that generates the atmosphere, then that condenses, then that generates the ocean, okay? And then that lingers for a while and it generates life, and then life lingers for a long time and becomes intelligence question mark, okay? That's the history of the whole planet. Dust, rock, air, water, life, intelligence question mark. And so I think we revere it because it compacts all of that in a way we don't even have to articulate. Next slide. And art. This is a classic Impressionist painting of the southern shore of Connecticut. And there's stone walls in most of these Impressionistic landscape paintings. But if you go to the previous art school, the Hudson River School, there's hardly a stone wall in any of them, even when there's stone in the scene. The artist just skips that part. So one generation wants to paint stone walls out, one wants to paint them in. After this, we went through a time when the U.S. was incentivizing farmers to destroy their walls. Tractors wanted bigger fields, and walls made good drains, and so they were paying you, like putting solar panels. You know, you get that tax incentive to do it. They wanted you to bury your walls, and so we lost probably half the walls. Not here, but some here. Underneath the main turnpike, underneath Route 6, you know, we've basically, you know, crushed the walls up for rock. I'll show you a couple slides. For crushed stone. Next slide. I just love this picture. I took it up in Western Mass somewhere. But the key idea is that you're looking at 3 habitats here. Not one. If this was just a slope or a field, it would be 1 habitat. Put a wall there, you get 3. Notice how the ferns are on one side and the herbs and forbs are on another one? This is for the garden club too. All right? And that's because the soils are different, and the soils are different because the wall is there. And the wall is there being a habitat, a dry land desert habitat that's pretty narrow, but still real. It's just as much of a place without surface moisture as any Red Rock Canyon, scree slope out in the west. It's in a network instead of in an expanse. You know what I mean by slide rock below the west and the cliffs? It's like that. It's a habitat. Next slide. And folk art. I forget who sent me this, but it's so cool I keep showing it and apologizing for forgetting the name. But somebody sent me this and said, "What do you think of it?" And I said, "I love it." All right. Is it what? Is it a ceremonial stone landscape? Is it just somebody having fun? Is it a teenager making a hideout? Is it a place to store potatoes? Is it a root cellar? I don't know. But it sure is neat, and it's definitely folk art. Next slide. And when I read, I'm sure you have books that you've read and say, oh my God, I never thought of it that way. Whoa, what an idea. And it changes the way you think. I've had a few books like that, and one of them was this one by a landscape historian named J. Brinkerhoff Jackson. And the title of the book is The Necessity for Ruins. The Necessity for Ruins. And he says, historic preservation, we met with several people today about that. It sees history not as continuity, but as a dramatic discontinuity. You don't have to agree with me. I just like this way. There has to be that interval of neglect. It's religiously and artistically essential. That's what I mean by the necessity for ruins. And it's the idea, if you go to the hardware store and you buy a saw, like a buck saw, right? And it's brand new and it costs you, say, 40 bucks, right? Take it home and it's worth 30, all right? Use it a few times, it becomes used. Let it rust in the backyard, and it becomes worthless. It's probably worth a penny or nothing at all, right? But if somebody finds it a century later, you know, and it's a 17th century buck saw, right? Now it has great value. So all antiques follow this same formula. There has to be that dip in value. And on the other side of that dip, we value them. So your walls are worth more, right, now than they were in the past. They're Robert Frost was the one that really nailed that. You know, the walls are more valuable for the connotations and the cultural ideology and the history embedded in our daily lives and the calendars, you know, and the postcards and the websites, you know, they're really valuable for that rather than fences, because most of these had barbed wire on the top of them anyway. Next slide. Oh, by the way, on the left, let's go back one slide. Can you remember? There you go. So you can barely see the title on the left. We need to adjust the projector for the next group of slides, color slides, because it's a nice title. Next slide. Okay, I don't know if you know Simon Schama, but I just love this guy. He's an architectural historian, and he writes this doorstopper of a book called Landscape and Memory. I mean, it's a massive. Has anybody read it out here? Yeah, like 7 hands. It's a really interesting book. And so he surveys the history of architecture everywhere. And how does he end the book? With a humble stone wall. You know, by this time it's architecture. I was just jumping out of my pants when I read that. All right? And this is Little Compton. Because you can get to Providence in how long? How long? 50 minutes? Yeah, okay. Okay, then Little Compton. There are places like Little Compton woven within the boundaries of modern metropolitan sprawl, Boston, New York, Providence, da-da-da-da-da, you know, Newport, right, where the boundaries between past and present, wild and domestic, collapse altogether. I just love that. This is Thoreau's kind of suburb. Henry David Thoreau. Yeah, bring it on. That's what we mean. Why does this architectural historian end with that word, that line at the very end of his book? Because they matter. Next slide. I got lucky. I published a long essay in the Smithsonian, and they said, can you add more paragraphs? So I got a big one in there, all right? And the idea is that though these are originally barriers between properties and between fields to manage them well, I mean, you got to admit a wall is a barrier, right, by definition, all right? The region's abandoned farmstead walls have since become the binding threads of its regional cultural fabric, okay? Get out of your Rhode Island mind for a minute and think of yourself as a New Englander, okay? If it's possible. It's hard with roadies, I know that, all right? By the way, I lived 6 years on Jamestown, so I know this place, all right? And I used to float freelance for the Projo before but they never got a front page coverage from them, that's for sure. That's pretty cool. All right, but they're the binding of its regional culture. And what I mean is that they connect you. We're not talking about lobster pots and lighthouses, you know? Or saltwater taffy, right? We got that, right? That's along the shore. That's New England, it's great. I like it. But if you come in from the shore just a few miles, just a few miles, all right? The rural landscape I'm talking about is the one that is crisscrossed with stone walls, just about everywhere. They are defining of the landscape. They are cultural threads that hold it together. It's okay for you to like Vermont and New Hampshire, okay? Because they're part of the same region. Next slide. And political. These political times, I'm talking political unity. You know how Vermont has a grief with New Hampshire and vice versa? They like to play off of each other. You do know that, don't you? I mean, that's one of the first things I learned about here when I got to New England. But the walls don't give a damn, okay? They look the same in Vermont as they do in New Hampshire if you're near the river, and if you're on the same rock, they look exactly the same, all right? So there's no such thing as a New Hampshire wall and a Vermont wall. They look alike when the other conditions are alike. It doesn't matter what the politics are. It doesn't matter what the state history is. The walls unify the region. Next slide. Robert Frost caught it perfectly. We're talking 1914 when he publishes Mending Wall. The idea of breaking down barriers, you know. I mean, Jack Kennedy sent Robert Frost to Russia to deal with Nikita Khrushchev because he wrote a poem about the boundary walls, you know, and having respectable boundaries. I think that's pretty cool. And it comes from the poem Mending Wall, which is definitely the most famous. I read it as a kid in Illinois. You know, it's the most famous. Next slide. Okay, the thing about getting young people, which, I mean, anyone younger than 40, right? Getting them, I'm way past that, okay? Getting young people out there, these are real, they're not digital. You know, there's something authentic and real outside. And they're physically active. To be walking around measuring and mapping is taking pictures and Googling and getting your GPS addresses. You know, that's outdoor work, and that's technical work. They could do that. And it's also helping the community. We really need to figure out a way to do that, and I think stone walls are the way to do that. You know, just inventory and mapping. In my town, we have a bunch of young people, you know, like college interns and minimum wage employees and volunteers and whatever. They're out pulling invasive weeds, right? Well, inventorying walls is a lot more fun, right? But everything else in that formula is the same. So I think it could work here if you have enough teenagers. I haven't seen any. Next slide. I'm sure they exist. I'm glad you laughed at that. You know, it's not like my kids are still in the house. You know, they're long, long gone. Next slide. These are just some slides of threats. This is the sign that I see on the way here. And I decided that on the way home, I'm going to go to Staples, all right, which is about 4 miles past this, and buy a sign the same size, and right underneath of it, you know, please don't strip mine the landscape. All right, you know, that's what I'm going to do. I promise I'm going to do that. I've driven by it 5 or 6 times, and I've said, oh, I got to do that someday. And I'm just so mad today, I decided to do it. All right. Yeah, in Connecticut. And on the left here, the New York Times said, you're the stone wall guy. Will you write us an opinion? And they labeled it strip mining history. I thought that was the perfect header. I've written hundreds I was a journalist for 15 years, so I know that I don't pick any titles. I've written 9 books. I didn't pick any titles of any of them. You know, the publishers pick them. They hate my titles. They're too wonky. They're not marketing, all right? But that's a good title because that's exactly what I think. The biggest threat to old stone walls is people. It's not your bittersweet on the walls. It's people selling them. Next slide.
And Rhode Island is a state law that you cannot do that.
Yes. I'm not sure if you can't sell them. You can't go and take them off anyone's property. You can't sell them. That's good to know. Can you give me the link or the address? I didn't know that. There's a Leona Helmsley Act that I worked on years ago, and I looked it up, and it didn't say that you can't sell them, but I believe you. I just would love to have a citation for that. I'm easy to find if you can't get me afterwards. Thank you for that. So this guy, Oliver Bowles, is the U.S.'s chief mining engineer. Now put this in perspective in time, 1939. What happened? Middle class just got wheels. They just got automobiles. in the 1930s, and they hated those New England roads, right? What you want was crushed rock for a nice subgrade on those roads. They do it on, and so what did this guy come up with? He's the mining engineer. He says, let's just take all the roadside walls and crush them up for roadbed. And nobody gave him any grief. All right, so I think about a third of the walls disappeared this way. And it makes sense, you know, it's a ready source of stone right where you want it, and people don't care about the walls, they care about the roads and their butts, you know, bumping along on those old roads. So it was his idea to do it, and he would have taken a wall like this, for example. That's a photo out of his book. Hard to believe, but you know, culture changes. The priority was rubber tires and good roads. 1930s. Next slide. There's a rock crusher on the left. It's really easy to crush a stone wall. I think that's late 19th century, early 20th century. I forget the date. And on the right, this is the most obscene thing I've ever seen. This is a photograph from 1920. This, believe it or not, is the White Mountain National Forest. I mean, that's a gorgeous place. And what did they do to the roadside walls? They didn't even bother to crush them. They took them apart and laid them down as roadbed. Do you see that? That's the sub-pavement. Unbelievable. Next slide. Did that. Okay, so threats. You guys aren't a threat to stone walls, I don't think, or you wouldn't be here. Next slide. First of all, the phenomenon we're talking about has an epicenter. And the way you get an epicenter is you draw a circle that takes in the whole phenomenon, and southern Maine is loaded with walls, right? And most of New Hampshire, Vermont have them. Staten Island has walls, you know, and so does Fairfield County, Connecticut, a lot of stone. And Nantucket, you see, Cape Cod. So there's stone walls in that circle of yellow, and the middle of the dot comes right in the middle of the region. And I drew a yellow, you can barely see it, but there's a yellow irregular blob, amoeba-like blob in there. That's the distribution of stone walls on the landscape in great detail, all right? And that circle just approximates that. So I'm going to call it an epicenter. And it's 40,000 square miles. That's a lot. Next slide. And the kind of New England on the left is a very discrete region. The Hudson River is on the left, you know, and it goes right to the St. Lawrence Seaway. This is one of those old Rand McNally style maps. I just put it up for old time's sake. All right. And even the boundary between Maine and New Brunswick has the St. Johns River Valley. Does a really nice job of demarcating it. Okay, so New England is a very coherent region. And on the right, all we have is a colored strip map of the rock types that you have in New England. All right, and if you'll notice, Narragansett Basin is the gray stuff down on the left. All right, well, it actually goes over towards Boston, but that's soft rock. And the purple is mostly granite. The pink is mostly granite. The purple is the kind of rock that I live in. It's called the Central Maine terrain. It's basically mountain root stuff. You know, it's deep, crystalline, hard, strong rock. And that dominates New England. You get to the west of New England, the rock types get more variable. That's the attachment point of New England that drifted in and stuck against proto-North America. But my key point here is that this is a mountain root with hard crystalline rocks. And it's a unique and distinct region defined by its geology. Next slide. And this is the Venn diagram of stone walls that I mentioned earlier. Now, people have asked me, why do we have so many stone walls in New England and not elsewhere in the United States? Yes, you can get a wall in in Santa Fe. Yeah, you can have a wall in Upper Michigan. Yeah, you can have a wall in the Sierras. You get them here and there. You get them in Kentucky, you know, bluegrass country walls. You get walls here and there, but they're not a regional phenomenon. The reason they have is that all three conditions are met. One, hard rock. Okay, if you travel from Boston to Buffalo on back roads, if you can imagine doing that, you know, not the interstate, you know, 90, I think it's 90, right? Yeah, not that road, but just come down one and drive it on back roads. What you'll find is everywhere in Massachusetts and even in Westchester County, you know, you've got wall. You climb up across the Hudson, no walls. The reason you went from hard rock to soft rock, okay? If you're in southern Maine, the dairy country is loaded with walls. They're everywhere, all right? They're all over the place, crisscrossing up in and around the Lake District. They're not as dense as here, but they are present. But if you go north and northwest, you go up in the lakes, woods country, they disappear. Why? Because you lose the farm culture. You've got hard rocks, right? And you've got glacier bottom soils, but you don't have the livestock tillage culture that needs fences and boundaries, okay? And if you go from Fairfield County, Connecticut, which is loaded with stone walls, and you cross the Big Apple and you come out the other side in central New Jersey, you don't have any walls. Why? Because you don't have the glacier bottom soils. You see? You have the hard rocks at depth, and you have the livestock tillage culture, but you're missing one ingredient. So if this is a Venn diagram, and those are the three circles, hard rock, livestock tillage culture, and glacier bottom soils, if you put those three together, there's only one place in the country that they intersect at a regional scale, and that's here. And that's why New England has walls and others don't. That's, of course, a generalization, but it works pretty well. I'm moving rapidly along. Next slide. Okay, this is the key slide in the history. Rhode Island's the anomaly. It's the green bar on the left. But let me explain this diagram before you doze off. On the left, that's the forest cover in percent. What does that tell you at 1600? That New England in every state is 90% forested. Anything that isn't a dune or a marsh or a rock outcrop or a lake, all right, is forested. You see? And then if you look at on the right, that's the population of New England. The population is an exponential rise right to the end of this chart. Can you see that? The timelines are from 1600 to a little after 2000, okay? So we got that. This is Harvard Forest data because they looked into the deforestation history. Now look at the dark line. The dark line is the average for the entire region. And let's just look at that for now. So this is deforestation. It's a proxy for stone wall building that's one generation early, okay? Because it takes a while to cut the trees away and have the rock accumulate so you can build the walls. But let's just look at the dark line. What we have is very, very slow removal of trees up until around 17 whatever. That's right around the time we became a new republic, you know, the end of the Revolutionary War. And after the end of the Revolutionary War, which was 1783, look at that chart, 1783, all right? Whoa, look at the rate of deforestation goes way up. It's like quadruples. And it bottoms out right around Thoreau's era in the 1860 when he's talking about how he's living in a treeless landscape, all right? And at that time, look at the average. New England as an average doesn't do much because you're averaging northern Maine and northern New Hampshire and western Mass, you see. But if you look at Rhode Island, which is the dark green line on the bottom left, Rhode Island doesn't have that two-part thing, does it? It has a steady deforestation all the way through. That's because it's coastal, it's small, and it's wealthy, okay? And so you just had not wealthy in the sense of billionaires, but I mean wealthy enough, you know, to keep making progress and not have any Great Depressions, all right? And what happens is, yes, it does pick up, and it peaks out a little bit earlier because, you know, that makes sense. You're southern and more intense, all right? And it recovers more slowly. But look at Connecticut, just to the left. Thank you. Connecticut, just to the left, is Massachusetts is the dark blue one. Look at that. Slow, 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 super rapid. And then back up again. So basically, this is the history of deforestation in New England, reconstructed from many sources and tons of dissertations. Okay, so it's quite a compilation. And so just now redraw this curve and move it one generation to the right, and that's probably, you know, the history of stone walling here. And you've got a lot of it so a lot of your walls are colonial. You see that? Because you already have removed 30% of the forest cover before the Revolution. Not so elsewhere. You get this? So this is one thing that makes Rhode Island different. All right, this is a state average. It includes Exeter, you know, way up off to the west, you know, where it's all forested. So So that's enough. That's enough. Look at poor Maine on the top, okay? It stayed 90% almost until the 1800s, and then the loggers went at it, but they still only made a dent in it, you see? Because it's just so big. Maine dwarfs Rhode Island when you start compiling statistics at the state level. Good, we're past that. Let's move on. And I want you to, thinking about that diagram, I want you to think about the stone walls of New England, not Rhode Island, okay? A wave versus a continuum. Let's back up one slide. You're doing a great job. He's a volunteer over there. He had a more comfortable seat until I asked him to do this. Let's go back. There you go. See, think of this as a wave, right? A wave of deforestation that accelerates and then relaxes. All right? Now let's go forward one slide. So the wall on the left, which is kind of typical for, even if those boulders weren't round, it would look like what I see in Little Compton. You know, they're flat and grainy, right? But that's a typical wall for New England. There's a lot of space. They don't get, Bill McKibben said, now I know why all walls are thigh high in New England, right? It's because that's about the human skeleton. It's less about the need for fencing. It's about moving stone. But look at in Ireland to the right. You know, this is not a wave of settlement that goes through Ireland. They've been there for thousands of years, okay? And so you get more and more and more intense modification of the land because you're staying in one place. The walls get higher, they get more concentrated, and they get better built, okay? And we would have the same if the Hudson River were an ocean, you know, and the ice sheet boundary was not. If people stayed in New England and didn't have a chance to go anywhere else, they would have intensified, you know, to like the Block Island scenario. Okay, next slide. Now, we're still on the origin, and let's go to the anthill. The ant doesn't give a damn about its hill, this hill, okay? It's just trying to get rid of the grains of sand because it's living its underground life. That's what it thinks about. It's like our transfer stations. You know, you bring your stuff there and you can forget about it, right? The ant brings it up and it drops it, and it forms a beautiful radial cone, not because the ant is doing that. That's what happens. You know, when you have a growing cone. A cinder cone does the same thing. It maintains that same parabolic shape as it grows, right? And so does an anthill. And so my suggestion is that on the upper part, we just have the edge of a pasture, and you can see where stone comes from, you know, with grazing animals and chomping vegetation, sheep, and John Muir called sheep woolly locusts. I know it's a big deal for Rhode Island sheep farming, but woolly locusts. I saw some sheep today. They're cute, you got to admit. They're even cute when they're all shaven. But this thing on the right, that's just a line of dumped stone, you see? And so this is getting rid of stone. Next slide. And these are really cool. These are frost-sorted polygons in the Arctic. And so this is a natural process that over thousands of square miles and kilometers will basically sort fine-grained materials. They'll move the coarse stuff aside, right? And when two cells on opposite side collide, you know, moving outward from the fine-grained, slightly higher centers, you get these frost-sorted polygons. And so at the crudest sense, the walls, before their fences, before their functional fences, are polygons of linear landfills, okay? In other words, it's a place to put stone along fence line. Not always, but in Rhode Island, again, it's more of the exception. But this is a natural process, and my human ecology is that human beings are doing much the same. They're impelled to move stone away from centers towards edges, and they congregate at the edges. I have a question.
That is not man-made?
No, it's not man-made. They're beautiful stone polygons. And think about a beehive. Think about the hexagons in a beehive. Think about the hexagons on these beautiful basalt columns. Think about the hexagons on the dried up lake floor, mud cracks. You know, those are natural because it has to do with horizontal tensile stress on an infinite surface.
Will the soil texture help create that over time?
It's this is all natural, and what it is there are convective cells of frost heaving that take place in the ground that will simulate getting rid of coarse stone on edges in a hexagonal pattern. Yeah. I came a whiskers close from doing a dissertation on this kind of stuff. I'm glad I didn't. Next slide. And on the left, one of these is a stone wall pattern and one is an ice polygon pattern. On the far left, that's Petersham, Mass. You know, those are walls mapped in the 30s by Harvard Forest. And on the right, that's Ellesmere Island frost-sorted polygons. Okay? It's roughly the same scale. And on the right, that's a mud crack. See the pattern? It's a fractal growth. You know, one crack, then a subsequent crack, then another one and another one. You keep subdividing those farms or those fields until they get smaller stone enclosures. That's an analogy from physics. Next slide. Okay, now this is a ridiculously long slide for this time of a talk, but the basic idea is there's a cascade of processes that happen. Farmer walks in, decides to start a piece of land, they cut the trees, what happens? Rocks, soil physics, micrometeorology, scuttle and dump, stack, conserve arable space, market territory, basal fencel, rising up, established farm, country estates, that happens, comes in. And then after that, we have abandonment in much of New England, but not in Little Compton. We did here, but it's come back again in the post-ruburbia. You know what ruburbia is? It's not suburbia, and it's not urban. It's not rural. It's a contraction of suburban and rural, and it's where you live here. If you can get within a good medical center and a university within an hour or 2 hours, you're in ruburbia as far as I'm concerned. You have everything. Forget Amazon. Forget that whole thing. You know, you can get somewhere. But where my relatives homesteaded in North Dakota, it's like 4 hours to the nearest 4-lane highway, and it's like 3 hours. It's ridiculous. You know, you if you go to college, you know, you have to go 400 miles. It's ridiculous. So this is ruburbia, and this is what Simon Schama was writing about. It has all the advantages, right, of that rural living without the disadvantages. Next slide. I got to move on. Okay, so you can also do the cascade chapter by chapter. I wrote this book in published in 2002. Okay, that's a ridiculously long time ago. All right, but the 10 chapters still talk about what actually happened. Number one, there's olden New England. Why was it so similar? Not climatically, but soil and texture, the geology. Okay, making the stone. You got to make stone. You got to bury the stone. You got to take the forest. You got to generate copious stone. You got to build walls with all that stone. Then you abandon the land. Then the rural revival. This has to do with, wheels, rubber tires, gasoline. We're talking 1920s and 30s. And that's, if you look at so many rural towns in New England, the population by the U.S. Census, it peaks. It bottoms out right around 1920, 30, and then it rises back up again. And that's about cars. And many of you reoccupy and move to rural properties, and own them beginning on that time because it was possible to do. And then back to nature and written stone. The last chapter is quasi, borders on philosophical quotes. But that's my progression. And you know what? I wouldn't change a whole lot of it, after 22 years. An accidental book that turned out to be fairly interesting. And that's my beaten up used copy on the left with the worn out, completely worn medallion for the best nonfiction in the state for Connecticut in that year. Totally wore it out. Next slide. Alternate history, you can't even read the thing. History in books is on the bottom. The subtitle of that book is The History in New England Stone Walls, not of New England Stone Walls. Because if it's of New England stone walls, you're going to read about them or hear about them and write it down. All right? But in stone walls means you have to look at the stone, draw some conclusions, make the story fit the observations, and it's like detective work, making a new source. Next slide. This is about all you get, cutting stone, building walls out of the old journals. That's about all you get. They don't tell you why the wall looks the way it does, or how big it is, or why it's even being built. It just tells you what happened. This is normal. Next slide. And I love this one. This is forget the color. It is red. It's a beautiful jasper red. But this is a stone in Hillstead in a lovely rural museum in Connecticut, in Farmington. And yeah, it's a stone wall, and you walk by it, and it's got a red stone. Well, why? That's a volcanic, that's jasper. It's the mineral jasper. It's a hydrothermal volcanic precipitate, on the edges of basalt stones. And the stones on the lower left are hard granites that have been carried by the ice sheet. The one on the upper left is that dinosaur-bearing rift stone, and the one on the upper right is a beautiful basalt flow, like lava, hardened lava. Now, Hawaii is made of that. And then you have the microbial stuff and the algae and the fungi that you can barely see. There's a habitat there. So this picture, as small as it is, shows you a lot of stories listed on the right that aren't in any of your history books and can be used for field trips and interesting things. I saw some cool stones here. Next slide. I like this one. This is what I call a petroleum wall. Okay, before front-end loaders and tractors and bucket, lifters and backhoes and things like that, most walls didn't have gigantic boulders on the top of them because there was too much trouble. But with those front-end loaders, you can finally clear those big stones out of the way that have been bugging you, for a long time. And so you did. And so there's a whole layer of petroleum walls on top of the relict original wall. And that relic original wall from people hefting and hauling stones, right, is sitting on top of large stones that were dragged there by livestock. You see, this is not going to be in your history books, right? But here's a history, and there's a strand of barbed wire that just connects along there that nobody can see. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4 different events on this wall that make a lot of sense in history, and they're not written down in your history books. And you don't need to be a genius to figure it out. That's a pretty obvious, layering sequence there. Once you get a little bit of training, it's fairly straightforward. Next slide. Good, we finished the hardest part. I'm just to the recommendation. Next slide. Recommendation number 1, landscape is a public commons. Okay, Ralph Waldo Emerson said, Manning might own this field and Nelson that field, but nobody owns the landscape. So what each of you do matters. You have to work together to maintain a beautiful landscape. If one of you says, I'm going to conserve all of my walls, and everybody else took them all away, you would feel like, yeah, it's your property. You can do what you want on your property, but all the rest of your town doesn't look the same anymore. Just keep that in mind. I think you know that. Number 2, support the stakeholders. That sheet that was passed around, the sign-up sheet, you guys, they're trying to do something pioneering here. They're trying to pioneer a town-wide, inventory. I'm not going to do it, but some group is going to do it. And Donna mentioned the sign-up sheet. Please do that. And then 3 scenarios. For roadside heritage walls, that are being used, walls that are in the public mind, like around very close or on roadsides, I think you really got to get the stuff, the weeds and bittersweet off of them and do whatever it takes to get them off without toxifying the landscape. There are ways to do that. Luke, do I have permission to show your picture? Sure. Because you didn't email me back when I sent it to you. Because you were busy working with me this afternoon. That's why you didn't email. Okay? I'll show you that later. The second one is that if you have walls in the canopy forest, that are just on remote properties, let them be there. Don't try to fix a wall that falls down in the middle of the forest. It's busy being archaeology, it's busy being habitat, it's busy being history, and it's busy telling us how ephemeral our lives are relative to the natural process that will eventually take the whole thing apart, okay? Don't do that on roadside walls and like heritage walls, but on visible display walls. But my recommendation is let that happen in the deep woods. And thirdly, new and rebuilt walls. It's like if you want a brand new wall, my suggestion is don't do weird things with it. You know, try and emulate the local look. I got involved in several towns doing this. What's the local look? You could actually quantify that, but you can't say anything rigorous without having an inventory. What do your walls look like? Can you describe them to me? Yes. 2 years from now, you know, you can inventory them and say, well, most of them look like this, and here's, you know, we can even count them. Most are double walls. You know, how do you know that until you inventory them? Otherwise, it's just anecdotal. To turn this into a science, we got to really get at it. So the last slide, I think, is next. Permission? Granted. Good. So he cleared one. That's a before and after wall, and he grubbed it out. Yeah, it's hard work, right? But it's a hell of a lot easier to maintain than it is to undo. So that was a beautiful roadside wall that got completely covered over, and he went and cleared it. All right? So it's like it doesn't even exist until, if you can't see it, it doesn't really exist. Now, it's nice habitat, you know, for the nesting birds and whatever, but they can go elsewhere. Next slide. Good, I'm done. Thank you. If I went over, I'm sorry. Guess what? It says time question mark. You know what that's about? I got a whole nother talk after that. It was the science of stone walls, and I knew I wouldn't have any time, so I just cut it all off. And I thought I would do it this afternoon, but I didn't. So here's the deal. I will do Q&A for a while, and a round of applause for my clicker. Yay! And Donna, you got to cut them off. I will answer questions until you think, see, people are so polite. They don't want to leave, right? The last questions people leave. Look at them go. So I will start answer questions. Yes?
Just a reminder, though, there are book sales downstairs, and there are 2 sign-ups if you want to be involved in working on preservation of walls.
Thank you for the introduction.
Oh, you,
I forgot your name, though.
Carolyn.
Carolyn, yeah. You look good on the front page of the Providence Journal. I got this one first.
Okay, so, we also have a house in New Hampshire, even though we're here now.
Yeah.
One of the walls, the town wanted to move it a little.
In New Hampshire or here?
Yeah, in New Hampshire. And it's a roadside wall.
Yeah.
And our house started about 1728, so we figured these walls were, you know, early 18th century.
Yeah, yeah.
However, when the Historical Society researched it, they said they were rebuilt as a project in the 30s, you know, to provide work for people and related to the colonial revival. So I wondered what you know about, you know, work project walls from the 20s and 30s, if actually a lot of the older walls are from the 20th century.
I know that the Work Project Administration did hire people to do all kinds of things, one of which was to rebuild roadside walls. But if you want, I have not researched the phenomenon. I don't think it's terribly common. I think that it is very real, and the records would be in the Works Projects Administration or in the town. But they're not going to tell you the details, like I've been trying to show you details. It'll just be hired a crew, they restack the wall, end of story.
Do you think it's on the same site built on the original underground foundation of an old wall?
You could work on that. You could find that out if you looked in the subsoil and did an analysis and looked at the foundation stones carefully. But my guess is they widened the road and moved the wall. But you know, I'm just speculating. But it's a good question. Yes, walls are rebuilt, and so it's hard. It's very hard to say how old a wall is. It's like how old are you? It depends on when you ask. You know, because they're continuing to be you know, maintained. Some walls are walked away from, and they are preserved gorgeously for 200 years, you know, in the forest. But especially the roadside ones have been compromised in many ways. But not yours. You have a lot of nice roadside walls here that I think some are, of course, built in the last you know, few decades or last half century. But many of them look like they've been there for quite a while. Not all of the main roads one, but on some of the hinterland roads. Okay, so that's a question. There's one there. Yes, thank you.
What do you know about the role of the Spotted Indians in building our walls? You know,
Well, first of all, there's no question that if people, Indians or indigenous, have been here for 15,000 years, that they're going to move stone on the landscape and do stuff with it. We don't know what that is. They might build a little cairn here or a little blind there, but they've done something. They can't have no print on the landscape. So we do have objects in our milieu, unless they've been totally destroyed, that predate colonial settlement, but none of the big wall patterns. That's all colonial stuff. And then to get to your question, there's no question that the indigenous Narragansetts, I don't really know about the Sakonnet group, were specialized in hiring themselves out as masons for pay. It became a specialized profession for some groups within that indigenous community that continues through this day. And I can't say anything about the local scene right here. I just don't know. But it's a really important question to keep in mind, that in the midst here are objects that have been here for a long time. We just don't know what they are. Yeah, comment here or question.
Luke Driver, I just wanted to say that the art and tradition of building walls is 5,500 years old.
Yeah, okay. 5,500 years old. It's where?
Orkney Islands?
Oh, yeah. Old world stuff, yeah. There are even hunting blinds built that are 12,000 years old. There's a stone wall that's been submerged by the Baltic Sea rising up, that was used to drive caribou, before the sea even came up. It really goes way back. And the dry stone walling tradition he's talking about in Northwest Europe in the glacial soils is very old. Yeah, so 5,000 years of stonework gives you a lot of interesting things.
And it's passed down generations.
Yeah, I just reread Robert McFarlane's book, The Wild Places. God, that's a really good book. It's about a resonance with landscape, and he travels through much of that. And the walls are so important in speaking to us. Whether you're conscious of it or not, your subconscious just groks it. You remember the word grok? Oh, I used to love that word. Then it went out passé. I'm starting to use it now just for fun. Yeah.
There's a local landscaper who keeps teasing me that he's going to come and steal my stones because they're special stones. What they are, I have no idea.
She said she has a landscaper that's going to come and steal her stones. Why would he tell you that? All right, we will end on a happy note, but I will tell you a sad story. A wonderful woman about your age was talking to me. She came up and asked me a question after one of my talks about 5 years ago, and she said, "What do you do to prevent people from stealing stones on the roadsides?" And I said, "It's really hard." And I said, "Well, why do you ask?" And she said, "Well, here's the story." Because I asked her because she said she had a carpet thrown over her walls. So imagine your roadside walls are covered with old carpets, right? Yeah, it sounds ludicrous, but here's what she said. She said, "My husband and I built that wall." It was right outside their kitchen window. "My husband and I spent years building that stone wall, right, together. I'm now a widow, okay? And people are coming by and they're stealing my stones that we built." And so she said, I'll never forget what she said. She said, "I'd rather know it's there than look at it." That's sad. But that's reality. If you want to talk about conservation, am I being recorded? Yeah. It isn't hard to steal a wall. All you need is one guy ahead with a flashlight, and one guy behind with a flashlight, and one guy in the middle with a vehicle like a truck or something like that, right? Or a team. And what happens is, if a car's coming on some dark road, right, you flash the group and they get in the car and drive away, right? You get enough lead time. But there's almost no way to stop this, all right? I hope so, because he wouldn't tell you otherwise. But if you get my idea, and if the car's coming the other way, you get the flash and you get on the way. I've heard a lot of stories, and many of them are sad, and I've seen a lot of stolen stone, especially capstones on roadside double walls. They will be just stolen. Well, if they're huge, then he's not only joking, he's He's teasing you because he's not going to take them because he can't.
He just likes the type of stone it is.
What he does is he likes you. He wants to have a story with you. Yes, question.
Could you possibly comment, and I don't know whether it's aesthetic or functional, at a opening in a stone wall, you see the granite vertical pieces.
Oh, coping stones. Yeah. Yeah, the question is, I think, if you see a wall and you've got the vertical coping stones, that's a traditional style for, Europe, West Europe, all right? And even Southern Europe to have coping stones, but it's not New England style. So, and I think it's okay here and there, but I wouldn't like to see all of your walls turned into coping stone walls, all right? And that's, the builder or the owner can decide what they want to do. Right, but one of the things that I've been trying to promulgate or suggest is that if you're going to have new walls built, you can zone what a sign looks like, or what a roadside looks like, or what color a house is painted. You don't have purple houses in Little Compton, but somebody could just paint their house purple if you didn't have a regulation saying that. You don't? Yeah. Well, then you've got a really nice community. Yeah, peer pressure works. Ask any teenager. Peer pressure is kind of rough, though, but it works. I'm glad it works. So my bias is to decorate with coping stones here and there, but just to keep that maybe artisanship alive, but not to do a lot of it. I think you get your archetype. What is an archetype? This is why you need an inventory. What does an archetype wall for Little Compton look like? How do you answer that question? You answer it by knowing what a variety of walls look like, and you have measurements or observations or metrics or something that talks about what the wall has or doesn't have, and then you use that as a centroid to decide that as a target for what a rebuilt wall should look like or a new wall should look like. Should is a rough word in a country that values private property and free expression for artists. I don't know about you, but that heart is just beautiful stone sculpture, right? And I don't think that it would look good in a lot of places around here, unless it was inside your property as part of the, like an outdoor art exhibit, because that's what it looks like to me. But this is just, my opinion. And I don't have any say over what you guys do. Zero. Yeah.
Have you built a stone wall?
I did. That's a good question. I'm embarrassed to say that the same thing happened as with chess, okay? When I learned how to play chess, I became obsessed with it. And I thought the whole idea of thinking ahead and moving, building walls and whatever. And I built a stone wall, short stretch in front of a garden that I had on a property. And I got bored after like 4 hours. And I love the outdoor aerobic stuff. I love the heft of stone. I loved all of that. I loved getting it better than I liked building it. Because I wasn't very good I'm actually very good spatially. But for some reason it was like knitting. I tried, I was going to be a real, back in the old day when, I could show that I could knit, right? A real man knows how to knit. That was kind of my stupid comment. So I bought all the knitting supplies and I lasted about 4 hours. Yeah. Yeah.
It's about this high, it's done on the ravel. Somebody did some logging across the street, I think it vibrated or something. If somebody's taking stones out, I don't know. I live on Dirt Road in Clinton, Connecticut, and it's one of those wide, I can show you a picture of it.
Well, come up later and show me a picture, but what's your question?
I just wanted to see what kind of wall it was, so
Oh, I can help you with that.
if I could rebuild it the way it's
Well, remember, I'm not a great builder. I'm trying to do the science of this landform. That's my gig. Okay, well, they quit making pennies. Okay, you already asked a question. Let's get one back here. Sorry, I've been a teacher too long. Yeah.
So I think, if I'm understanding correctly, you said earlier in the lecture that the main function of the walls for modern agriculture farming was actually the livestock, to keep animals in.
Okay.
But I think you also said that the geology is such as that when they were clearing land, the stones would come to the surface, and they'd have to be kind of removed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, but wouldn't that happen like anyway, regardless of whether someone was doing livestock or just like ordinary agriculture? Or that's really my question.
No, when you deglatiate the landscape, it looks like a moonscape. It's just rocks and stone everywhere. And it took 15,000 years to bury those stones. And there's something called a biomantle. What happens is that an ant in your soil, it can lift a grain of sand, but it can't lift a pebble, right? And so what happens is if you have 15,000 years of ants working in your soil, or earthworms or whatever, what happens is there's a net sinking of the stones because the fine-grained material is deposited above them, all right? They're not sinking through anything, it's just the fine grain from underneath is taken up to the top. So they descend. And so it's not like there weren't places around here that weren't just terribly stony, right at the outset. But most farmers avoided land that was just nothing but stone. All right? But what happened was when you clear the field, I'm glad you asked. I will talk about frost heave. Okay, I'm sorry. You guys are really good. You're here. You're interested. I'm going to do one story, and I will answer your question. Is that take an egg carton, right? Take all the eggs out, right? And then put a bean in one of the things and put the eggs back, right? What happens is what happened to the egg with the bean under it? It's sticking up. You see? All right, so then do it again and again and again and again. And do it in every piece of the egg carton. What happens is the eggs basically float up until they spill out of the egg carton because they've got beans underneath. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the frost pull hypothesis for frost heave. And basically what happens is if you freeze down to a stone, the top of the stone is frozen before the bottom, isn't it? So you adhere that stone, and the soil is expanding because soil expands when it freezes. We all know that, right? So what basically happens is that the upper part of the soil is lifting that stone up when there's unfrozen soil underneath of it, you see? And then an ant or a worm or a cricket or something is in there, and a little clod of dirt falls down under that stone. You understand? And then the stone is being set, when the thaw comes, it's nicely set back down like the egg in the carton, but there's a pebble underneath the stone now, you see, or it's squished in or something, and it can't go all the way down. So what happens is the rest of the soil settles around the lifted stone. And so the interesting thing about frost heave is that it's actually not the stone that's coming up out of the ground, it's the ground settling against a stationary stone. Does that make sense? So that's one of about 5 mechanisms that cause stones to rise. And so let's just say frost is the most important thing. Also, when you have a spring rain on frost, you know what it looks like. Vermont calls it mud season, right? So if you have the frozen ground and a rain, you get that gooey, sloppy, wet, erodible stuff that goes everywhere. So you basically wash away the fine-grained stuff, concentrating any stone on the surface. And the combination of enhanced frost heaving and enhanced spring thaw causes you to concentrate stone on the surface. And this is nucleated by cutting the trees off. Because when you cut the trees off, you have greater wind exposure. You have, in low light winters, you have deeper freeze. And meanwhile, if you lose the organic matter, you have a higher thermal conductivity of the soil, And so all of those factors come together by changing the micrometeorology. The woods used to have hardly any frost below the surface crust. You go out and punch a hole through the crust and you get under the leaf litter and it's not frozen below that. But if you clear the forest, let's put it this way. The forest has only a little bit of a crust frozen in New England, in central New England, let's just say. But if you cut that trees and have a golf course fairway, the ground will freeze this deep, okay? It'll freeze this deep. But on the cart path, where the golf carts go, where it's compacted, you'll get frost this deep. So by clearing away the trees, and you get the lawn, and then clearing away the lawn, and you get the hard-packed trail, you are increasing the depth of freeze when the climate is the same. You see? So what happens is by clearing the land, you generate the stones. Not all of them, and that's a generalization, but I hope it makes sense to you physically, and I hope the analogy of the egg carton works, because it's just, it's a frame of reference problem. I work with teenagers all the time, 19, 20, 21, 22. They're like, 13, 14, 15, 16, but they're really older than that. They're called college students. And the frame of reference is something that I'm trying to teach them. What's the frame of reference when you call something this or that? What's your reference relative to some other person or some other organism or some other planet? What's the frame of reference that you're thinking about? And that's really what I'm talking about with the frost heave thing. What's your frame of reference? The stones heave up. No. Yeah, some do, because there's a final mechanism called the frost pull hypothesis, which is that the stone is a better conductor of heat than is the adjacent soil. And so when you freeze down, you freeze through the stone and it nucleates ice crystals underneath of it, okay? And that will cause the stone to be lifted a little bit, because ice expands when it freezes. But that's only the final entity. Most of the time, it's just that egg carton phenomenon that I'm talking about. And I have living proof of that. I rerouted the entrance to my house 1 year ago. Everything was fine. I put a paved gravel driveway there where there used to be lawn. Not driveway, but like a walkway, crushed rock driveway. And instead of going here, it went like that. And I had 3 big boulders come up through that, all right? 4 years later, they started poking through. And finally, after the 3rd or 4th year, I said, I got to get this out of here because it's right in my walkway. And so I got out my spade and I started shoveling that thing, and it was huge. It took me like a whole day to get the darn thing out. So it was a big stone rising because I changed the surface thermal conductivity.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think I'm being cut off here. I think that's great. I think you've all done enough of this, especially those guys that came for 3 talks. I've had fun. Bye-bye.